she flew across the world to marry a man who turned his back. The moment he saw her skin, .. in a quiet rural town where tradition speaks louder than love, a beautiful black woman named Amara arrives with hope in her eyes and a marriage contract in hand. But when the man she came for recoils in disgust at first sight, her heart shatters. Left stranded and humiliated in a land of strangers, Amara's story seems destined for tragedy, until a silent man on the hill watches from afar. The dusty pickup truck rolled into the town square just before noon. The heat shimmered on the asphalt, rising in waves that made the distant silos blur like mirages. From the cracked passenger door stepped Amarato, slender, with a long floral dress catching the breeze like a flag of quiet resilience. Her skin was deep brown and glowing under the midday sun, and her hair was tied into neat coils that bounced slightly with each step. A nervous smile played at the edge of her lips, and in her hands she held a worn envelope. It had been opened and refolded so many times. The creases had turned white. Inside was a letter, still faintly smelling of tobacco and ink, with promises, written in a man's crooked hand. Gerald. He had written of lonely nights and empty fields, of wanting warmth beside him, and hands to help on the land. He had said he was tired of eating dinner alone, tired of talking to himself. His words had been plain, simple, but they had touched something deep inside Amara, a girl raised in a small village outside Nairobi. She'd grown up watching the women in her life break their backs for men who gave them nothing but bruises and silence. When the idea of a mail-order marriage had first surfaced in her church, she laughed, but then the laughter faded, and she began to think. What if love wasn't born from childhood crushes or romance novels? What if it was a decision, something you worked toward like a harvest? So she had replied. Now, here she stood, in a town that smelled like cattle feed and corn husks, where the only sounds were the creak of a rusted flagpole and the slow clunk of a screen door swinging open. Gerald stepped out of the general store with a brown paper bag under his arm, and a frown on his face. He looked exactly like his photograph: broad shoulders, weathered jaw, thinning hair under a dusty cap. But there was something in his eyes that hadn't been in the photo, a shadow, a wall. His steps slowed as he approached her. His gaze dropped to the envelope in her hand, then rose hesitated on his skin. She saw it, that split-second shift in his expression. Surprise first, then confusion, then something much colder. This. This isn't what I agreed to, Gerald muttered, his voice low but not low enough. The few people lingering around the square began to glance up from their benches and coffee cups. Amara's smile faltered. Gerald, she said, her voice soft, reaching. It's me, Amara. His jaw tightened. You didn't say you were like this. Her heart began to pound. Like what she asked, though she knew the answer. Knew it from the way he took a half step back, from the way his fingers clenched the bag tighter. You people don't belong here, he muttered, voice now sharp as a corn husk blade. This isn't the city. This isn't T. Africa, but we wrote letters, she said, forcing the words through a dry throat. You said you wanted a wife. I wanted a real wife, he snapped, spitting the word like poison. Then, in one sudden, cruel gesture, he dropped her suitcase from the truck bed onto the ground. The lock snapped open. Clothes carefully folded and packed spilled into the dust. A pale green scarf caught the wind and drifted toward the porch. Steps of the general store. No one moved to help her. She stood frozen, heart pounding, eyes burning. A fly buzzed lazily past her ear. A little boy across the street pointed and whispered something to his mother. The woman pulled him close and walked briskly away. The moment stretched too long. Then a sound broke it, a cough, deliberate. It came from behind the grain silo, where a man leaned against an old red tractor. His arms were crossed over a faded denim shirt. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, its shadow hiding most of his face, but his stance was calm, solid, unmoved by the scene unraveling in front of him. Elias Stone. Amara didn't know his name then, only that he was watching, and unlike the others, his eyes didn't flinch, didn't judge. They held something else, like he was measuring the weight of silence. She looked at him for a moment too long, and he nodded, once barely noticeable, a gesture not of sympathy but of understanding. She knelt down quietly, picking up her clothes. With trembling fingers, her knees sank into the dirt. Gerald didn't offer to help. In fact, he turned around and walked back into the store, slamming the door behind him. The square was quiet again. The wind swept up a piece of her blouse and pressed it against the curb. She gathered everything in silence and sat on the edge of the sidewalk, unsure of where to go. Her ride, the driver from the nearby train station, had already left. Her phone was dead. She had no idea how far the next town was or who she could call. The letter, now useless, lay limp in her lap. Minutes passed. Then the tractor's engine sputtered to life. The man behind the wheel didn't drive off, he just sat there for a moment, then slowly turned it toward the road and pulled up beside her. You need a lift somewhere, he asked. His voice was deep, low, not kind. She looked up at him, blinking back the welling tears. I don't know where to go. I've got a guest house, he said. Was my folks' place. You're welcome to it for a night or two. She didn't move, he added. It's clean, got food, no strings. She hesitated. Everything in her warned her not to trust strangers, but she was alone, and the look in his eyes, steady, not pitiful, calmed something wild in her chest. "What's your name?" she asked. "Elias." She took a breath. "Amara." He nodded again. "Nice to meet you." Amara. With no one else offering, she climbed into the passenger seat. Asterisk. Elias Stone was a man of few words and many wounds. The kind of man who knew the exact weight of a bag of wheat just by lifting it with one hand, who remembered the feel of his mother's fingers smoothing his hair while his father's boots thudded across the floor. He carried history in his bones, not in stories. And his farm-wide golden breathing in the rhythm of the seasons was the only companion who knew all his secrets and never demanded more. He was not the kind of man who chased town gossip or ever entered a conversation he couldn't quietly walk out of. He lived on the edge of the town in a farmhouse shaded by old elms, its roof patched more times than he could count. The land had made him rich, not because he asked it to, but because he listened to it when others tried to force it. He learned when to sow, when to wait, when to let things die. That evening, as the sun melted behind the hills and turned the sky a bruise-colored violet, Elias pulled his pickup alongside the narrow dirt road that curved past the town's edge. There, just outside the reach of the streetlights, sat the girl from the square. Amara. She was crouched low, trying to dust off the hem of her dress, still stained with dry earth and quiet humiliation. Her fingers trembled slightly. The wind tugged at a thin scarf around her shoulders, lifting it like a whisper and letting it fall again. He rolled down the window slowly, careful not to startle her. She glanced up, surprised, and something in her face, something that had held firm hours before, had softened, broken around the edges. "You need a place to stay?" he asked. She straightened, but said nothing for a second. The silence between them stretched like an unspoken test. Then she shook her head slowly. "I'm not charity. I don't offer charity," he replied. "I offer respect." It wasn't the words that made her pause. It was the way he said them, like he'd lived them, like he wasn't just trying to be kind, but trying to offer her something human, without the weight of debt. She didn't trust him, not fully, but she didn't feel fear either. And that was more than she could say about the last 24 hours. So she nodded once and rose to her feet. He reached across to open the door, and she climbed in without another word. The ride to the farm was quiet. The tires hummed against gravel, and the radio, set low to an old jazz station, crackled in and out of tune. She looked out the window at the passing fences, the silos lined up like sentinels in the distance, and the wheat that seemed to bow beneath the weight of the coming dusk. When they reached the guest house, Elias parked beneath the crooked lamppost and opened the trunk. She made a move to get out, but he held up a hand. "You go ahead. I'll bring your things." She didn't argue. Her legs were tired, her heart even more so. The guest house was modest but warm. A porch swing creaked softly in the evening breeze, and the porch light buzzed gently, drawing lazy moths to its glow. Inside, the walls were painted the color of butter and the wooden floor smelled faintly of lemon oil and cedar. A fire had already been lit in the small hearth, and beside the sofa was a folded quilt that smelled like someone's grandmother, not staged, lived in. She stood in the doorway, unsure if she should cry or laugh. Elias placed her bags just inside and gave a quiet nod. "There's food in the fridge, towels in the linen cabinet. I'll leave you to rest." She turned to him. "Thank you." He nodded again, but this time slower. "You let me know if you need anything." Then he left. That night, Amara stood under the hot shower for so long the steam coated the mirror in thick fog. She washed the dust off her skin, but not the ache. The ache would take time. She slept with the window cracked open, letting the chorus of crickets and rustling trees lull her to a fitful, dreamless rest. The next morning she found a note slid under the door. "Coffee in the barn kitchen. I'm around, no rush." She didn't go, not that day. Instead, she sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and watched the sun crawl across the fields. The wind whispered over the wheat, making it sway in long, gentle waves, like fingers combing hair. She breathed in the quiet. It didn't ask her to explain herself. The following day she walked toward the barn. Elias was there, stacking hay bales like it was nothing. He worked in silence, the muscles in his arms moving like old pullets used familiar. When he saw her, he nodded. "You eat." She shook her head. He poured her a cup of coffee and handed her a slice of cornbread from the tin on the counter. He didn't ask why she hadn't come yesterday. He didn't ask anything. She sat on a wooden crate and ate in silence, feeling the warmth spread from her fingers into her chest. It wasn't the best breakfast she'd had in her life, but it was the first in days that didn't taste like shame. Over the next week, she kept to herself mostly, but Elias kept showing up in quiet ways. A new pair of gloves on the porch rail, a wool coat that somehow fit just right, folded beside the door, a book on the kitchen table with a note that said, "Thought you might like it." She never saw him leave the things. He never asked if she'd like them, but she knew it was him. By the 10th day, she wandered into the fields without realizing it. Her feet carried her along the edge of the wheat, and then into the rows. The smell of soil and grain filled her lungs like something sacred. She had spent most of her life in cities, around cement and steel. But something about this land made her feel less like a visitor and more like someone being remembered. She saw him in the distance, fixing the irrigation pipe, shirt off, back streaked with sweat and dust. She hesitated, then walked closer. Need help? He glanced up, smiled. Sure. From that moment on, a slow rhythm formed. She rose early, helped feed the chickens, learned the quirks of the goats, and slowly, carefully, began planting near the west patch. He taught her how to test the soil's moisture with just her fingers, how to listen for the bees and what it meant if they stopped coming. She listened more than she spoke. He spoke more with his actions than with words, but what grew between them was not rushed. It was not coated in flirtation or romance. It was something quieter, like trust, like respect, like healing. One morning, after the early frost had left a silver sheen on the barn roof, they worked side by side harvesting root vegetables. The crates filled slowly. She brushed a smudge of dirt from her cheek and looked at him. You don't talk much, do you? He chuckled. Not unless I've got something worth saying. She nodded, biting back a smile. That's fair. They worked a bit longer before he paused, leaning on his shovel, and looked at her. You were never meant for a man like Gerald. She turned, eyebrows raised. He didn't say it cruelly, just plainly, like truth. You were meant for the land, for something strong. Like this. She blinked. There was no poetry in his tone, just certainty. And that was when she saw it. In his eyes, the softness, the want, not hunger, not need. Just the kind of want that comes when someone finally realizes they've found a piece they didn't know they were missing. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Later that evening she found a basket left by the porch swing. Inside was a freshly baked pie. The scent made her eyes water. A note beneath it, in that same messy handwriting. Thought you might miss home tonight. This is my mother's recipe. She used to say pie can stitch any tear. She laughed softly, wiped her eyes. Then she carried the pie inside, knowing something had already begun stitching, quietly, carefully, stitch by stitch. The harvest moon hung heavy and glowing above the fields, painting the horizon in molten silver and shadow. Every tree, every barn roof, every blade of wheat shimmered as if lit from within. The wind carried the soft scent of roasted corn, apple, cider, and wood smoke as the townsfolk gathered in the clearing just past the town square, where the ground flattened out like nature's dance floor. String lights looped from tree to tree, glowing amber and gold, while paper lanterns drifted lazily overhead, casting their soft halos across the wide-open dark. Laughter bubbled beneath the fiddles, old folk tunes rising from the bandstand made of hay bales and lumber. Children ran in circles, their boots kicking up little clouds of dust, while old couples held each other like they'd been born dancing. Women in long skirts spun, and their laughter echoed like church bells over the hum of the music. The entire town, so closed in its ways, so cautious in its steps, had opened itself this one night for joy. And yet, in the middle of it all, Amara stood alone. She wore a dress she had sewn herself from repurposed fabric Elias had left in a trunk. It hugged her shoulders and spilled down like midnight wine, the color catching the moonlight in a way that made her look like a living flame. But no one dared approach her. They noticed her, of course. Their eyes followed her as she stood near the edge of the crowd, pretending to admire the pie table or feign interest in the children's games. But she wasn't invisible. She was other. Beautiful, yes. Graceful, certainly. But other, and that meant uninvited. She had tried not to care, had told herself again and again that she didn't need to be accepted by people who had watched her humiliation in the town square just weeks ago and said nothing. She had told herself she came tonight only for the lights, the music, maybe the warm cider. But standing there, watching couples laugh and spin under lanterns, her heart betrayed her. She wanted someone to see her, and then someone did. Elias. He stood across the clearing, near the edge of the firelight, dressed in simple flannel and jeans that bore the scent of hay and cedar. He hadn't danced yet that night. He never did. People respected him but didn't understand him, and he rarely made himself more visible than necessary. But now, his eyes were fixed on her, and for the first time in years, Elias Stone looked like a man no longer content to be a quiet observer. His boots crunched softly against the dirt as he made his way across the clearing. The fiddle slowed into a gentle waltz, and a hush fell in his wake. It wasn't a loud kind of silence. It was the sharp kind. The kind that pricks the back of your neck and makes the corners of mouths fall open. He stopped just before her, a foot away, and extended his hand. Will you dance with me? It wasn't a performance. He didn't say it with swagger or flair. He said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, as if it had never occurred to him that anyone would think it strange. Amara hesitated, not because she didn't want to but because she saw, from the corners of her vision, the ripple moving through the crowd. Gasps, glances, the silent sting of disapproval hidden behind raised brows and drawn lips. But Elias didn't flinch. He just waited, and in that pause, she realized the only person who mattered in that moment was the one holding out his hand. She placed hers in his dot. The world didn't stop, but for a second, it did hold its breath. He led her to the open space beneath the largest oak, where the ground was smooth and wide, and the lights above swayed gently with the wind. He placed one hand gently at the small of her back, the other still holding hers, and began to move, not like a man who knew how to waltz, but like a man who knew how to listen. Every step was slow, careful, like he was memorizing the rhythm of her body, learning her one movement at a time. They danced slow, powerful, and as the fiddles played, the whispers died out, first into hush, then into stillness, then, impossibly, into... Here was a black woman who had been rejected publicly, humiliated in front of all of them, now adored, held, cherished by the richest, most respected man in the county, a man who had never danced before, not once in all his years of attending the festival. They danced like no one was watching, and like everyone had always been watching and finally saw something they didn't know they needed to. Amara's breath trembled. Elias looked into her eyes like they were stars he'd never seen before, and for the first time in her life, she felt what it meant to be wanted in silence, not for how she looked, not for what she offered, not even for the pain she'd endured, but just her. They danced through 2 songs, then 3. The band slowed the tempo to a hush, and when the music finally paused for a breath, Elias leaned close and whispered against her temple, barely audible under the canopy of lanterns, "You're not alone anymore." She didn't speak, just leaned her head into his shoulder and closed her eyes. Later that night, after the lanterns had dimmed and the fiddles packed away their bows, Elias walked her back to the farmhouse. The air was cool, and her dress fluttered like a sail in the breeze. The stars above them blinked like curious eyes, and the crunch of gravel beneath their steps marked the quiet walk back toward something unspoken. At the porch. Beneath the porch light now flickering low, he turned to her. His face, half in shadow, was soft in ways she hadn't seen before. Vulnerable, open. "Amara," he said, his voice a thread pulled from the heart of the earth. "I didn't order a bride, but if I could have described the perfect one, it would have been you." Her breath caught, and then her tears came, not like a storm this time, not like something breaking, but like a gentle, slow stream. Soft, steady, healing. These weren't tears of sadness. They weren't born of pain. They were born of being seen fully, completely, without shame. For the first time in her life, she felt like she could cry and not apologize for it. Elias stepped closer, one hand resting over hers. "You don't have to say anything." She nodded. Lips parted, then whispered through a breath, "I've waited a long time to be loved like this." He smiled, not a big smile, not loud, just enough. "Then let's not waste any more time." And they stood there, under the soft hum of the porchlight and the ever-watchful stars, letting the moment stretch between them like a promise neither one of them had to say aloud. Not long after, Amara began keeping her shoes by the door. Scar found a permanent place on the coat rack beside his flannel jacket. She planted herbs near the windowsill. He started baking more. They laughed more. People in town began to look differently at them, not all at once, not warmly, but with a growing, reluctant respect. The Harvest Festival dance had been a turning point, not a revolution, but a slow shift, like the tilting of the earth before spring. One day, while repairing a broken gate together, Elias turned to her and asked, without ceremony, "You think you'll ever miss where you came from?" Amara looked up, squinting into the sun, and answered, "I'll always carry it with me, but I think I've found a new kind of home." He nodded and went back to hammering. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfort. Love, real love, doesn't arrive like lightning. It builds like soil, layer by layer, history by history, broken piece by broken piece. What they were building wasn't just romance, it was repair. Later that winter, just as the first snow dusted the barn roof and the last of the wheat had been stored, Elias brought out a ring. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't gold, it was silver and worn and had belonged to his grandmother. He held it out without kneeling, no speeches, no theatrics. Just this: "I never thought someone like you would choose someone like me, but if you'll have me, I'll spend the rest of my days making sure you never feel alone again." She slipped the ring onto her finger and whispered, "You never had to ask." And so, in the middle of a quiet town, beneath the wide open sky, surrounded by fields that listened more than they judged, two people who were never supposed to find each other did, not because the world gave them permission, but because they chose it anyway, and that was enough.